Hi, Ricardo.
Hello?
Hi there. How you doing today?
Oh, hi, Miss Evans. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Finals week getting underway?
Yeah, a little bit busy of a week. Couple of
Sure.
papers I still need to finish.
Yeah.
Yeah, other than that, fine.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it. We got one more minute. I'm trying to hold out so that maybe somebody else will join us. We'll see. We're
Yeah.
recording today so that if the people couldn't make it to this morning, they could at least look at the recording. So
All right. I actually didn't have any questions on this week's quiz.
oh, good.
Yeah, I submitted yesterday and I did
Okay,
pretty well, so I was happy about that. There were
good.
there were
All
even a
right.
couple of questions I wasn't 100% sure on, but I was like, I'm gonna try this by myself, and then if I have some like questions on it, then I'd ask you. But no, it turned out pretty well. I think the questions I wasn't 100% sure on were on like whether or not the voussoirs like their position in regard to the roasting
Um,
windows, something like that.
yeah. So,
I think it was whether they were above or below, but I think you
oh,
mentioned that at one point. So
they jet out and above.
mhm.
Yeah, I remember that question. Hi, Hayden. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start.
I, I think I was confused because what's that thing that's below the King's something?
The
'Cause
King's Gallery.
yeah, I think you mentioned the King's Gallery is below at one point. I think that's why I wasn't sure, but I don't.
No, the King's Gallery is
Mhm,
usually high up on the cathedral, and then the
mhm,
voussoir is the like decoration that comes out from the top of the door portal.
mhm.
So when we get to the Gothic review, I'll point it out to you.
Right.
Okay. All right. So this is review for the final for Art History 1. And I'm sorry it says 2020. I updated it. So don't think I'm giving you old information. I promise it's current. All right. Well, I employed a tool here that I didn't need to. Let me get rid of that. Okay. So the exam's going to open on Monday. It closes on the 13th, which is Thursday. So that's different than our usual Sunday deadline. So just pay attention there so you don't accidentally miss the exam. What happens if you miss the exam? Well, because it's the final, I can't really grant you an extension because I've got to get it graded so I can turn the grades in. So if you have a recognized excuse, I'll accept your exam on a date that we agree upon. But we've got to accommodate the final exam or the final grade deadline. And if you need, more than 24 hours, you're probably going to have to take an incomplete so that you can get your extension. So should you have some unforeseen circumstance, just let me know. We can talk about it and see what your options are. All right. The exam will be in the exact same format as a second exam. There's no changes, which means that we're still going to time parts 1 and 2 independently so that you have more time to write in the second part. And you're not feeling so stressed about being able to relax and write. One of the things about the final exam that I think is kind of nice is you don't have as many time periods to choose from. So you've got early medieval, Etonian, Romanesque, and then all of the Gothic, early, high, and late. So you're definitely going to want to know the difference between early, high, and late Gothic. And we'll go over it here in just a minute. But it's technically only, well, it's 6 eras, but the Gothic takes up half of it. So it's a little bit easier, I think, to determine the difference between the different eras. All right, so let's talk about early medieval art. We get lots of illuminated manuscripts, carpet pages before gospel text, which came into play because people during the early medieval times, a lot of them did not read. The church would have one Bible, and the carpet page would often mark an important event in the Bible. So a good example of that is the Cairo Ota page that we studied marks the appearance of the birth of Christ. So when something important comes up in the gospel, usually a decorative page will preview it so that the person knows something important or special is happening. We find that early medieval art is often interlaced with zoomorphic forms, meaning we talked about that animal style that's sort of created between the syncretism of Christian imagery and the indigenous cultures imagery. And there tends to not be any narrative behind the decorative works of art. We're often looking at images from the British Isles, in Northern Europe. Art rallies around Christian themes. The monasteries are really the epicenter of innovation at this time. The monasteries produce most of the written works that we have from this era. And in medieval times, most people lived in an isolated system, meaning that towns were insulated in sort of working order in that town. So there were goods that came in and out of the town, but the town was sustainable on its own. We get themes of the gospel, lots of symbolic images. And we talked about the animal style, the interlacing syncretism between the warlords and Christian imagery. So a lot of the imagery that we see is not very natural, it's highly stylized. And here's a good example of that. So here you've got the animal form, or the animal style. And we call that the animal style because we don't really know what animal it is. That thing looks sort of like a cross between a dinosaur and a giraffe. And they have some sense of aggression because they like bite each other's heads. And then you've got this nice interlacing pattern that is from the indigenous culture's original style of art. Remember that in the early medieval, we get some specialized skill sets in metalworking, especially art needs to be portable because the indigenous people are moving from area to area. They're warlike and they're just competing for natural resources and control of land, very much like where we started from in this course in the ancient Sumerians. So this kind of comes full circle after the Roman Empire. That complex economic system that the Roman Empire had falls. And so you get a more centralized economic system within each town. And that brings about specialties in art and regional specialties in terms of crafts and trades. Remember that the metalworking we call cloisonné. It's an enameling technique in which the metal is carved and then a well is dug in the metal and then a precious material is inlaid in the metal and heated to create an enamel. This is the purse cover from the ship burial at Sutton Hoo. And you can see that it also has animal style. You've got this mythological bird creature here on the back of a duckish creature. And then of course, all this beautiful patterning that surrounds the purse lid cover. The next era of art that we covered is Etonian. The Etonians had three kings that were important. They were King Otto I, King Otto II, and King Otto III. They tried to preserve the Carolingian traditions that Charlemagne's empire had sort of rekindled, mostly because Charlemagne was so successful that the Etonian kings felt like if they could sort of ride on the coattails of Charlemagne, that they would be successful as well. They align with the papacy in Italy and Rome. And that alliance seems to create a positive culture for economic prosperity. The culture's renewed for a short period of time. It starts to thrive again, much like the Roman Empire, and then it falls. We don't really actually know what happened to the Etonian kings or exactly why it fell. We just know that it did. They love art, and King Otto III himself was a pupil of Bishop Bernwards, who was an artist. So I've got a list of monuments for you. They're just churches and different works of art that we looked at that are important. And the reading section doesn't pertain to this class, but the monument list does. And then of course, the terms of the different Germanic tribes that we looked at were important as well. So I just included that in here. Remember that Etonian art stylistically looks a little bit Roman. When you look at Etonian art, if you look at it in terms of a linear timeline, it bridges the gap between medieval decorative art and the simplicity of Romanesque. It sort of falls in the middle. And so you get this more stylized and simpler looking imagery compared to the highly decorative imagery of the warlords and the syncretized Christian imagery. This is syncretism too, because it's syncretism from the Roman Empire, but it just looks simpler. You can see the Corinthian columns, but they're a little bit more decorative because they have the faces on them. That's medieval influence. The art tends to look somewhat like a coloring book because it relies heavily on the outline to define the form. Lots of line definition going on. So then if you move on to the Romanesque, you can easily see how decorative the medieval is compared to the Romanesque. The Romanesque focuses on bigger churches with churches that have ambulatories so that pilgrimages or groups of pilgrims can come through the church without disturbing mass that's going on in the center. This is the Abbey Church of St. Michael in Hildesheim, Germany. Let's look at. Okay, so in Romanesque architecture, when you get a slide that has these churches that have these big chunky feeling walls and they look like they're built with Lego blocks, that is a Romanesque church. They focus on the ambulatories because their economic prosperity is coming from those pilgrimages that are coming from route to route. Remember that the pilgrimages were focused on stopping the caliphs from taking over in the East. So in the East, you've got Ottoman kings who are trying to control all of the Eastern territories and the Northern territories in Africa. They are successful in keeping the Northern territories in Africa. The Crusades really don't do much of anything in terms of securing Christianity, but for a short time, Spain becomes controlled by the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, I'm sorry, and then is taken back by the Crusades. So the southern part of Spain, the Christians win back, but everything else that they're trying to get back, they ends up becoming part of the Ottoman Empire. Sculpturally, we see tympanum sculpture. If you remember, those are those sculptures that tell stories about redemption and hell. They typically are meant to scare people into coming into the church, and they're a way for the church to kind of preach their message without having to actually send a messenger to deliver the message. Why do they want people to come in the door so bad? Usually it's because there's a monetary donation that's connected with it. Sculptures and manuscript illuminations recall the linear forms of the classical antiquity even more so than the Ottonian Empire that we just looked at. Churches contain relics that are kept for pilgrimage or for pilgrims to venerate. So, you know, I'm going to go back in and add into the slide a few examples of the relics that we've seen, as well as I'll add a slide or two so that you can have an example of a relic and a floor plan so you can see the ambulatory clearly. This church, St. Michael's of Hildesheim in Germany, was a church that is very classic Romanesque. You have these big, huge compound piers that support the church in the front. The church doesn't have a whole lot of decorative elements to it. The ceiling is highly decorative, but the walls are fairly plain. This alternating pattern of the light and dark, excuse me, if you remember, came from the Islamic tradition. And so by using these visual hallmarks of the Eastern tradition, they're trying to align with Eastern support. Oh, I did have a portal example. That was the thing that was bothering me. It just was in the middle. So here's a portal example. This is an example of the tympanum that we just talked about that preaches that message to get people in the door. Remember that this egg shape behind Christ is called a mandorla. It indicates who the Christ figure is. You could call it iconography if you wanted. And it tells, this is the Last Judgment by Giselbertus. It tells the story of sin and redemption and the sorting of the souls at the gates of heaven. So it's kind of the way to say, well, if you don't come into the church and repent of your sins, you'll end up going to the depths of hell instead of going to heaven where everybody wants to be. In Romanesque painting, we have, we end up with paintings that are inside the church. They look more like book illustrations than they really do look like the mosaics that were very decorative of the Roman Empire. They're not very realistic. They're highly stylized. They have a sense of schematism to them, just like the icons that we studied. They tend to be painted in bright colors, and the walls of the apse are very commonly painted. The other place we have lots of paintings are in the manuscript illuminations. At this time, that regional specialties still stays intact. So you end up with towns that have certain skills that they're known for. Belgium was known for metalworking. Northern parts of Europe were known for wood carving. So those type of specialized crafts come back in, or are still at play. And then we moved on to Gothic. So in general, the Gothic as a whole has some stylistic features. They focus on theology of the Virgin Mary and the life of the Christ and saints. We see lots of portraits and lots of life that's connected to the church. The churches are enormous, and that comes from the fact that the Crusades have brought people into the cities and towns, and the churches need more space. The Romanesque churches start to open up to accommodate those pilgrims, but once the pilgrims have once the Crusades start, the pilgrims start congregating in the towns, and they need bigger, better churches. They tend to have lavish ornamentation, and the materials that they use are highly decorative. For the Gothic period, the name of the game is height. They start this competition of who can have the highest, tallest, biggest, most impressive church. And part of that has to do with this man named Abbot Suger. He is the father of Gothic design. He designs the very first Gothic church. And he believes that the church should have an element of light to it, very much like Hagia Sophia did. And so he brings that light in through stained glass, which is part of why the church is trying so hard to build taller and add more height. They want to add more height because the more height you get, the larger the window, the more light you can bring in. In addition, they literally believe that the taller the church is, the closer their worship and prayers are to heaven. Stylistically, we see royal churches. They're funded by the kings and queens in the monarchy, and the kings and queens in the monarchy are buried in them. So it's sort of like how the ancient Egyptians built monuments. Same thing, they're just Christian monuments now. We see lots of rib vaulting and pointed arches, wide open spaces, lots of stained glass window, and that symbolic light that Abbot Suger pioneers called Lux Nova, and new innovations in architecture to continue to make the walls tall. This is Notre Dame, the probably most classic example of Gothic architecture. If you remember, Notre Dame starts in early Gothic and is then, it has a fire and then they rebuild it into high Gothic. It incorporates Lux Nova, which is that stained glass window effect with all the light coming in. And the quest for a taller church begins. We get lots of piercing in the facade of the church, which is this deep cutting into the window areas or into the fronts of the building to get a nice deep crevasse in the church. It gives it sort of a skeletal feeling. Windows are often circular. They like this rondelle shape. And then we get these large round windows that we call a rose window. Additionally, the flying buttress is invented, and the flying buttress is sort of the exoskeleton to the church. It props up the wall. What happens when you take away part of the wall mass as the wall becomes less stable. And so they figure out that the flying buttress will support the exterior wall so it doesn't fall away from the church. And it will allow them to open up the wall to add the windows. Early Gothic has some important characteristics within the decorative elements of sculpture on the facade of the church. One of those things are the jamb figures. So the jamb figures become part of sort of an indication of whether or not the church is early, high, or late Gothic. In the beginning, jamb figures are attached to the portal door. They are sort of feel like they're part of the door jamb. They really have no separation between the jamb and the decorative sculpture. The faces have very little individualism. You couldn't like plop one of these people on the street and be able to tell who they were in a crowd. They tend to be very elongated. Their body proportions are not all that natural. And they don't have as much detail to them. They're clothed in that wet drapery technique that was popular during the Roman Empire and the late Greek. But it doesn't cling to their body. It just adds to the elongation of the figure. As we get going through the Gothic, the image of the, I'll put that over there. The image of the jamb figure changes. It changes because, or it changes to look more natural and more humanistic. The figure has more individualism. You can see the body proportions starting to become more discernible, and they begin to step or pull away from the door jamb. So now there's some nice individualization between the figure and the door jamb, and the sculpture stands or seems to stand on a little pedestal. It makes the sculpture feel as if it's an actual sculpture instead of part of the door. In the High Gothic, we get something called the King's Gallery that's added. The King's Gallery honors usually kings that were an important part of the success of the church. Let's see what else. Piercing becomes more prevalent on the exterior of the church. And of course, we're still at that quest for bigger or taller, better, higher churches. Go ahead.
I had a question on the King's Gallery. So the King's Gallery and the jamb figures are two different things.
Yes, they are. So here, where I'm pointing on the screen, this is the King's Gallery. It's way up at the top. The jamb figures are down here.
Yeah.
At the door. Yeah. So the jamb figures are part of that portal. Now we talked earlier, you had a question about the voussoir. This area here, this big cutout piece that goes above the door, that's the voussoir. So it sort of comes out like an accordion or a trumpet and jets upward. Obviously trumpets are circular, but if you can kind of picture that image of the trumpet's bell coming at you, it's sort of the trumpet for the door. It announces, hey, this is where the door is. The Romanesque tendency to put a sculpture right here at the top of the door at the tympanum is changed, and they switch it out for these rose windows. The rose glass windows are a really important decorative element in the church. It's part of that Lux Nova that Abbot Suger begins.
Is that in the Gothic period overall, or more in the late Gothic than early Gothic?
It's part of the Gothic period overall, but as technology gets more and more advanced and they understand better how to support the walls without the mass of the wall being there, they grow in size. So if you get a church that, that I'm saying, is this early, high, or late? If you see tons of stained glass and less wall, you're looking at least high or late.
Got it.
Late is really super flamboyant. Like, we only looked at one late example, and when I show it to you, you'll right away see the difference. High Gothic is more that really classic lacy looking structure that feels sort of like it has an exoskeleton. It kind of has a spidery look to it because they're trying so hard to get the stained glass windows in the church so that the light comes in. So even in the areas where there's not an indoor section, so for example, in the Reims Cathedral, when you go into the Reims Cathedral, the indoor section ends about here and below. This all here and above, this stained glass window somehow goes into the interior, but this area here with all this deep piercing is exterior. So usually the bell tower is housed in one of these spires, in which the you get that story, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, where he runs up the spire and rings the bell every day. That's where it comes from. You get this deep piercing that allows the light to come into or through the exterior of the building. So they take this idea of Lux Nova and really push it.
So
They
are
really,
churches in the early Gothic period still using the Romanesque technique of like there was a difference you mentioned in the lecture that it's not as thick because they changed the material, I believe, something like that.
well, actually,
mhm.
they don't change the material. They change the amount of material they're
Hmm.
using. So it's the same material, but the amount of it, instead of having all that concrete that's building those big thick piers, they lessen the amount of concrete, make the wall thinner. The problem is the thinner you make the wall, the less support it has, right? Like all of a sudden you've got this paper thin wall that they want to build very tall. And so they figure out that if you're going to take mass out of the walls so that you can add windows, you've got to have some exterior support. And that's where the flying buttress comes in. Once they figure out how to support the wall, all of a sudden this quest for height just takes off because there's a technology innovation that happens within the architecture, and you get this just big boom. And what you'll see is that in any society from the time that we started, the minute you get more technology and population seem to follow itself. They have a reciprocal connection. So more people come in, more technology and innovation come in, more technology and innovation come in, more people come in. And so that's what you're seeing in the height of the Gothic era. You've got people coming in from the Romanesque time, from the Crusades, from city to city. And so the big churches that they built in the Romanesque time aren't big enough. They need more space.
That break from the Romanesque way of building the church is, you could say, it starts in early Gothic, but becomes like, I wouldn't say more noticeable, but these features that started in early Gothic are kind of enhanced by late Gothic or now.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So the features that start in the early Gothic are established by Abbot Suger. And at that point, when Abbot Suger designs the first Gothic church, there's a departure from that big, thick Romanesque wall. That big, thick Lego looking wall that they had changes. And these new features that Abbot Suger has put into the architecture change the face of architecture in the Western world forever. And that inkling of sort of like that spark of technology and innovation grows to this, and we even call the end of it flamboyant. It grows into this like flame of architecture and innovation within the buildings. And so it's most noticeable visually in the facade's exterior, because you get a whole different look from what the Romanesque churches were. The Romanesque churches were less decorative on the outside. They had less, they just looked very different. They had less piercing, they had less height, and they were big and bulky. And if you compare them to the Gothic church, you could almost say they're ugly, because they're just not as lacy, they're not as
And
decorative.
you didn't have the rose stained glass windows.
Exactly.
What was it called?
The
Tympanum?
tympanum
Tympanum.
changes, yeah.
Mhm.
So you go from having that sculpture that's here to having the rose window here. All that transfers into this quest for light. So in the late Gothic, you have two new styles that come about. The flamboyant style, so it goes, so the late Gothic sort of splits. One theory is to go towards the windows. We're gonna add as much window as we possibly can and bring as much light in as we possibly can. The other theory says, okay, we're gonna bring in light, but we're gonna bring in more structural element to the exterior. So if you went the window way, we call that the Rayonnaute style. It's less, the word I want to use is stick-like. It's less linear. The exterior is less lacy and frilly. On the outside, you get the less of that exoskeleton look, and more of that piercing in the walls. So the Rayonnaute style tends to focus on gold for the interior parts that are actual wall, and then red and blue stained glass for the windows. So if you get this church that's enormous, that has tons of red and blue stained glass with gold striping feeling, it's Rayonnaute style. And then you get the other group of people who focus on the exterior materials in the architecture, and we call this the flamboyant style. So if you look at it like the analogy of a fire, Abbot Suger starts the little flame, and it just keeps growing until we get this thing called flamboyant, and we get this giant raging fire. A very highly decorative style in which the church's decorative exterior grows to be nice and tall and thin and lacy looking, just like a fire. That's why we call it the flamboyant style. The jam figures, go ahead.
This is a bit unrelated with the flamboyant style, but I was wondering if the jam figures in the King's Gallery, is there a distinction of who is being depicted there, or
I believe the King's Gallery there is. I've never studied the intricacies of the figures, so we know that for the church at Notre Dame, there is a porch of the confessors and a porch of the martyrs. So they sort of group the different figures' identities together. So the porch of the confessors are those jam figures that were they spread Christianity. That's why they call it the porch of the confessors. And then the jam figures of the martyrs are people who died for the faith. So it would make logical sense that the King's Gallery would have images of the kings that contributed to the church. But I've never studied the figures on the exterior of the church enough to tell you that for sure.
I wonder if there's a correlation that like the King's Gallery is at a much higher standing,
Mm,
like a social class almost
that's
for
an interesting thought.
yeah.
I don't know. That's a great research question.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not a Gothic specialist, and I bet you a Gothic specialist or medieval specialist could tell you that right away. But yeah, now you've got me interested. That's a good thought, I think, to have. It would make logical sense that that's a way that the kings sort of say, "Hey,
Yeah.
you know,
Especially because we're talking about a time where they believed that the church needed to be taller to get closer to heaven, like their prayers getting closer to heaven. So having the kings like closer
yeah,
to heaven would make
yeah.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that idea that the kings were an intercessory figure between heaven and earth puts the kings at a Jesus-like status.
Yeah,
Um,
like the messenger.
yeah, yeah. So if you kind of take that all the way back to our Roman time period, remember we had those divisions of like heaven and earth in our manuscript illuminations. So that wouldn't surprise me. Like in the Roman times, well, in the early Christian manuscript illuminations, we saw more and more of that. So yeah, I would be interested to see about how that all translates into the exterior of the architecture. But it's all related. Like those philosophies sort of weave themselves through until we get into the early Renaissance. Then once the early Renaissance happens, there's a shift. So anytime technology comes, it seems to change art visually. And it's like I said, there's a correlation between people and technology and how the technology and people work together to create a visual change in the art. So if you trace it all the way back into even the prehistoric times, it's been that way. They get an innovation, something happens, and then it changes the way art looks as a whole. So then in the late Gothic, we also get this courtly style and sculpture, and they bring about something that becomes very popular in the early Renaissance, which is this S curve. So if you start with this line and you draw it to Mary's shoulders here, so you start at the opposite side of her head and you draw it to her shoulders. You then take the line down to the hip and then over again down to her feet, and you get this big S shape. We call it the S curve. And they employ this S curve because they're looking at the contrapposto of the Roman times. But it gets a little skewed. They think that I think part of it is because they're so focused on the religious imagery that they want Mary to be holding Jesus. So you get this kicked out hip here. But they look at this style and feel like it's more lifelike. And if you compare it to the early jam figures, it's a lot more lifelike. You go from being this like elongated part of the door to actually having a figure that's separate from the door that has a stance. So it's definitely more lifelike. It's got more humanism to it. So Mary's portrayed in a more worldly way. She's portrayed as a queen here on earth. And she holds Jesus like any woman would hold an infant. And so you get a rise of what we call humanism. And arguably people will argue that this depiction of the sculpture is more elegant. So then you come to the end of this course to preview art history 2, which is the nuances of the early Renaissance. So this style where you have more of the humanism is favored by the courts. I think it's favored so much by the courts because it puts power back into the hands of the court. They start with that idea of the divine right to rule, that God chose them and only them to rule the country for whatever reason. That idea of the birthright comes back into play. And we see great political changes in sort of the philosophy of power.
Um, the luxury arts that we had for like personal collections and sometimes church donations. In the lecture, you mentioned that there are like gold ones. Are there ivory ones too, or only gold?
Yeah, ivory is a luxury material that's often used at this time. I would say you find it more so in the medieval times with the monasteries, because they create these small ivory they look like triptychs. They're small and they have like two flaps that open and close. So like if you've got a piece of paper, there's a hinge here and it opens and closes this way, or it'll fold just in half. And it's usually handheld. So it's used for prayer purposes. So usually by the monastery. So if you're traveling, like maybe you travel to the next monastery over west or something like that, you take the ivory luxury good with you so that you have something to focus on when you pray. It's that Catholic tradition of having a visual object in front of you to pray. And so ivory is used for that purpose. We don't have as much of it that survives because it was smaller and handheld. And it becomes a lot more popular in the early Renaissance. We see it kind of die out after the Renaissance gets really going. But for now, they're definitely using those handheld ivory pieces. So have you had a chance to look at the review sheet?
Yes, I still want to go over the three lectures we have for the final once again to make sure I have all the terms
Okay.
like well defined. But yeah, other than that, I think I'm good to go with.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that is pretty much the sum of what you need to know for the exam. If you get to studying and go, wait a minute, I have a question, just pick up the phone and call. I'm happy to answer. And if I'm busy, I will call you back. But I'm happy to answer questions as you get going and studying. You have the weekend to prepare, so maybe you'll have time to sit and really focus.
When is the final again?
The final opens on Monday, and it closes on Thursday. So
Okay.
it's
Both parts.
I'm sorry.
Both parts.
Yeah, both
Okay,
parts.
cool. Thank you.
Sure.
Out of the three exams, we're getting one drop, right?
Mhm.
Getting
Yeah,
these
so
high grades.
yeah, you have to take all three, but I drop your lowest test score. So that's kind of important. Oftentimes when you're looking at Blackboard's total is going to be a lot higher. Like it'll tell you had a total of 495 points, and out of those 495 points, you've earned 400. But instead of dividing by 495, I'm going to divide by 395, which means I also have to back out your lowest score. So if you got like 50 points on the lowest exam, that 50 points comes out of your total earned, and I take out 100 from the total that I'm dividing. So you end up with a dropped test score. But sometimes that gets a little confusing when you start to look at Blackboard, because you're looking at it thinking, wait a minute.
Yeah, because you're gonna have a different grade on Blackboard than the final grade.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's not
exactly.
register grade, so I don't think that.
Right. I
yeah.
usually send an email like with a breakdown of this is how it was figured out. And that usually answers most people's questions. So I'll do that again, but I'm sure every once in a while I'll have somebody who's really confused. So if you get confused and you don't know what your grade's going to be and you're concerned about it, please just give me a call. The one thing I ask is you pay attention that last week, like once your exam's graded, if you have some question of some sort, that you pick up the phone and call, because once grades are turned in, they're final. So try to get that ahead
Yeah,
of that.
right now we're at, I think, 362. So with plus 100 of the final, we're going to be at 462. But
Exactly.
actually, we're going to be graded on 362 and not 400.
Exactly.
Okay.
But in your total, you'll have to take out your lowest test grade. So
Yeah.
if you earned 300, or let's say you earned 400 points out of that 462, you have to back out whatever the lowest amount of your test
Yeah,
score.
you're not going to have 400 out of 362.
Right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
that would be over 100%.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That means you get like 60 points of extra credit, plus I dropped your test score. So, yeah. And hopefully, you know, you've gotten through the testing process this third time and it sort of feels more natural to you, and you're able to really shine and put your skills that you've learned through the course into your final exam. I always tell my students in art history, the last thing you want to do is blow off the final exam. Like, you really want to put in what you've learned into it. I will reward you in your grade. Like if you started out and you were really confused and you've really grown, I'll reward you for that growth. So, Aiden, did you have any questions you needed to ask me?
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me know if you need something. Happy studying. And if I don't get to talk to you all again, I hope you have a wonderful break for the summer. And unless you're taking summer classes, and then I'll see you in the summer.
You too, Miss Evans. Thank you for the class. I enjoyed it, learned a lot from it.
Oh, good. I've enjoyed our conversations, Ricardo. So thank you so much for coming to office hours so we get to chat about art. I miss my students a lot.
Yeah, hopefully we can go back to classroom setting soon.
I think they're looking at it. I think we're getting there. So, all right, Aiden, I hope you have a great day. We'll see you
You too,
again
thank you.
soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.